Walter Chesley Harvey Jr. and Hazel Lucille Lunn request the honor of your presence at their marriage, June 4th, 1932, at St. James Episcopal Church, Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And this was then the beginning of what is to come. The real beginning of life for my brother and I actually had its start when our parents were married, June 4th, 1932. As of this date, that marriage has continued for 45 years. I shall try to write a story about this life as seen through my eyes, Phyllis Harvey, and told by Donn Harvey. Therefore, everything will not be 100% accurate, but as I was told it to be, or as I remembered it to be. Walter Chesley Harvey Jr. and Hazel Lucille Lunn were united in marriage by the Reverend Mr. Lord at St. James Episcopal Church, Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I really am not sure about their wedding, but it must have been good to have lasted so long. My dad must have treated my mom good because she still is as pretty as the day she was married. My mom did improve my dad because he is such a cutie. After all, who wants a grandpop that's skinny and has lots of hair? I think Edna Schnell, who is my godmother, was the maid of honor, and I know Gil Spann was the best man. That's about all I know. Isn't that a shame? My dad, who is known for years as Shorty, was born on October 22nd, 1909 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. He was born at home. It must have been a very good year, for he sure is one of the finest vintage. His mother was Maud Ferry Harvey, and his father was Walter Chesley Harvey Sr. I think they were married in St. John's, Newfoundland in 1903 and then migrated to Milwaukee. Now they were to have many children, but those that reached adulthood were Edward, Robert, Norman, Fred, Lillian, and my dad. Edward and Melva Harvey on their wedding day. They were to have one son, Walter. Ed died in 1936. I can't recall what Uncle Norm did for a living, but he married Anita and had two children, Marilyn and Barbara. Now Uncle Rob and Uncle Norm died in the early 1950s after our family had moved east. Aunt Lil as Job's daughter. I don't remember Aunt Lil at all, and I am not sure how many children she had or whom she was married to. She passed away also during the 1950s. Robert, known as Bob, was to become a baker, and he at one time owned 2 bakeries. Boy, did I think that was terrific. Daddy used to go there on Friday nights late or Saturday morning and bring home the best goodies. Uncle Bob was married to Elsie, and they went on to have 4 children. Fred and Vi on their wedding day. Now Fred, he was a butcher, and I remember he was a funny man. He used to always say something like, "Chickaboo." The last time I saw them was at their house in the lake in 1955. We traveled back to Milwaukee so I could be a bridesmaid in my cousin Nancy's wedding. Fred and Vi now spend part of each year in St. Petersburg, Florida. My mother was born Hazel Lucille Lunn on March 12, 1912 in Escanaba, Michigan. Actually, she was baptized Dolly Hazel Lucille when she was 6, and the name Dolly stuck with her for many years. My grandmother's name was Caroline, and my grandfather was Ole Lund. They were to have 8 children, Ralph, Ray, Amy, Lily, Percy, Leslie, Effie, and my mother Hazel. 6 children were born, and then about 10 years later my mom, and 4 years after that my Aunt Effie. Now Ralph was the oldest, and he lived to be about 72. He had 2 children. Uncle Ray married Aunt May on September 12, 19-something or another. Although I never saw them very much, I thought they were great. Uncle Ray once said, "I would give anything to know where I am going to die." We said, "For heaven's sakes, why?" His answer, "I wouldn't go there." Leslie was a house painter, and he was killed about 1942 when he fell off a roof. Leslie died very young in childbirth. I should say that it was Lily who died in childbirth and not Leslie. Now Percy, who I don't know is alive, and he lives in Merrill, Wisconsin, I believe. Amy married Bert, and they had 3 boys and 2 girls. Now I didn't really know her until after I was married, but by then she was real cute and funny lady with snow white hair. Effie, who was always my favorite aunt, married Jim Graham when she was 16. She was to continue having children until there were 15, including 2 sets of twins. Effie and Mother were always very close. Being born so much later than the others, they were raised together. When my mother was about 6, her parents were divorced, and her mom was to later marry Nels Nelson, a man who had never been married. I think this was about the time they went to live in West Dallas. Aunt Effie has always been very humorous. She would call my mom about 8 a.m. every day when we lived in Milwaukee, and they would chat. Now, when they didn't want you to know what they were saying, they would talk in Swedish. My mother helped to deliver Effie's firstborn child, Jim Jr., just 2 weeks before she herself was married. Uncle Jim is my mother's age, and when they were young, my mom also had a crush on him. He was a very handsome man. Now, Grandpa Nels raised them as his own and sent them to school. They didn't see much of their father unless Leslie would sneak Effie and Mom over to see him. Leslie was always my mother's favorite brother in those days because he was always so good to her. This is the house where Effie was born. Amy, Effie, Hazel, and their ma. Effie, Amy, Mom, their mom, and I think Uncle Bert, with Lois and Leatrice. Hazel was really groovy as a teenager, or so I have heard. Her parents were very strict and wouldn't let them do very much. They weren't too keen on all the schooling, so Mother left home just prior to her senior year in high school and went back to Escanaba. She went to live with an aunt and was made to go to Escanaba High School for 12th grade. While there, she was a super student and very popular with the boys. (1932). My parents were to begin married life in an apartment somewhere in Milwaukee. 1933. September 23rd, 1933, my mother gave birth to my brother Nels Walter Harvey. It was a difficult delivery and breech birth, and she was ill for a long time after. Nissy, as he was then called, sometimes had red curly hair. When they came home from the hospital, they went immediately to their new home in the then town of Granville. It was a really cute house. Although I don't remember the inside, they were so far out in the country, over a mile from public transportation, which could be brutal in Milwaukee winters. Now my brother, as the story goes, was called the Little King. He was very quiet, quite smart, and a very cute little boy. Many times during those years, my mom and dad were grateful for the older experience of their neighbors, the Benekeys. In later years, the Benekeys were to be grateful to my folks. At that time, my parents weren't attending any church, and a neighbor offered to take Nels to their Sunday school. All was fine until one day he came home and announced, "I am a fine Lutheran boy." That did it. Nels attended Carleton School, where ironically his own children were to one day attend. And this is the Benekeys. This is me and Nels. Now on July 16th, 1938, I finally arrived. However difficult childbirth was for my mom when Nels was born, it was then again that easy when I was born. My mother was mowing the lawn when her water broke, and soon thereafter along came me. I have continued to be that fast to this day. That must have been a real trying time when I was born, because all pictures from then on showed my daddy thinning on top and widening through the middle. There actually was a difference between Nels and I. Mother had quite a time chasing me and dragging Nels. We were as different as night and day. I did everything fast, and he did everything carefully. In addition to that, Nels did everything quietly, and I did everything loudly. The year was 1942, and the United States was at war. Mother and Daddy had saved enough money to raise the roof on their small home. Then Mother's brother Leslie was killed, and nobody had enough money to bury him, so the burden fell upon my folks. Now, about a week later, my brother and I were having a good time laughing and laughing in our shared bedroom. I was 3, and Nels was about 7 or just 8. My mother came into the room and told Nels to stop falling down, which you see made me laugh, but he didn't. Finally, she peeked in the crack in the door and saw that he couldn't help but fall down. It was discovered that he had polio. Now, my father carried this rather big boy into the hospital for admittance. He was there for a very long time. It was, I suppose, one of the saddest times in their lives. They could only visit him once a week, which made it even harder for them. While there, he contracted measles and whooping cough, I think. Then he came under the Sister Kenny treatment as one of 4 children they were experimenting with. Finally, after a very long time, heavy braces on his legs, and much exercise with my parents' help, he was cured. Such sadness followed by such joy. Now, of course, through all these trials, the money saved to raise the roof was all spent. Daddy was working 16 hours a day to pay the bills. But alas, they were very crowded in our little house, and Mother was never really happy there anyway, so they sold their home. So we moved to Elmhurst Road in Milwaukee. It was a pretty Dutch colonial home, but it had a sag in the floor. I remember that sag because my mother, who was a fine writer, wrote a story about it, and we were to have many laughs over it many years later. Now we were to live in this house for 10 years. For me, it was the large part of my early life, and it held many memories for me. It was in this house that I dropped my 15 cents down the toilet and called my grandpa up at work to tell him tearfully my tale of woe. He was the one, after all, who had given me the money after I danced for him, and you might have thought it was $1 million. It was in this house that Aunt Effie and Uncle Jimmy so often came to visit on Saturday mornings, with at least 5 different children each week. I remember them lined up on Mother's sofa in the living room until Uncle Jimmy said it was all right to go and play. Boy, did they let loose then. It was to this house my brother and cousin Jim, I think, returned after they had been on a bike ride and sprayed by a skunk. Oh my, what a smell. I think they buried their clothes in the backyard. We had lilacs, flowers, and a gym set of our own. We had a clothes chute and a milk box built right into the house. We were about the first to own a TV set of our very own. Saturday nights in 1950, my parents invited over friends to watch this funny little box with people inside. (1943 to 1953). During these years, my dad began working days. I remember how good he smelled at the breakfast table, and I remember how I ran to meet him when he came home from work. I remember Sunday for lunch, Daddy would make beef burgers, and they were so good. I remember our cat Missy and the time she brought home a rat. I remember going out to dinner with my parents on their wedding anniversaries. That sure was a biggie. I started wearing glasses and remember how white the Gimbel building was. I remember my brother jumping over a small fence at Peckham Junior High School and not quite making it. They told me he broke his leg, and I was sure it wasn't half. He spent quite a while in the hospital, and my folks had a bed put up for him in the sunroom while he was incapacitated. I remember getting braces on my teeth and those long trips down to Dr. Rhodes' office. I remember my parents' annual open house, the Sunday after Christmas from 2 to 5. Everyone stayed until the wee hours of the morning, however. Mother started baking months before and storing her cookies in cans under the cupboard. I remember when Nels and I would sneak a chocolate chip cookie that were meant for the party. I remember making my daddy a big bowl of popcorn every night. Remember no butter? I also remember the beginning of St. Timothy's Church. I should. It began in our basement. Actually, I think it was started because of Milwaukee's cold and snowy winters, and my mother and daddy got tired of standing and waiting for the bus to go to St. Paul's. They went to the bishop. I think Mother already had had it in with him because she was writing articles for him. Anyway, they put an article in the paper asking for anyone who was interested in an Episcopal church on the north side of Milwaukee to come to our house for a meeting. This was sometime in May 1949, I think. Now, the first one to arrive was Winston Luck, who was a banker, but he also played the organ, so of course he was recruited. Several other people were also interested, and that was the beginning. Now they set a day for their first service, not knowing where it would be held. Lo and behold, about a mile away, there was a Lutheran church that had begun building a new church, and they would let us use their old building for service on Sunday evenings. And on it continued, with many, many hours put into it by my mother as secretary and my father as rector's warden and doing anything else that was needed. When they finally left Milwaukee in 1953, St. Timothy's gave them a nice reception and a plaque which they have hanging on their home to this day. I remember my mother making big, huge rag rugs out of rags and string my father brought home from work. I remember my cousin Jim coming to live with us. I remember my mother's bridge parties and how she would say to me, "Now remember, this is my party. You come in and say hello and then disappear." And of course, I didn't always do that. I remember my brother and his paper route. He only collected when he needed money, and I also remember when he stole the nickel and got caught. I remember my J.C. Higgins bike. I was so thrilled. I had to put it in the basement at night, which was not an easy job. One night I cut my hand and did that cut bleed. My daddy said, "Dope, don't worry, it'll be gone by the time you're married." Well, I guess Daddy thought I was going to be an old maid because here I am on my second marriage and I still have the scar. I remember St. Paul's Church, Big Ears Tommy Michelis, confirmation classes, and playing the violin at the church. Boy, I was awful, but the song was good. I'm my old grandpa. I remember our neighborhood and Mr. Fredericks catching me eating clover on the front lawn. I remember Laurel and how my parents said to bring home any papers around their house called the Daily Worker or something like that. They were, after all, communists. I remember those things. Do you? Sometime in the late 40s, we started camping. We began with 2 pump tents and a Coleman lantern and stove. We went to Terry Andrews State Park near Sheboygan, Wisconsin. Of course, our equipment improved with time, and we became seasoned campers. We would set up our equipment around Memorial Day and take it down around Labor Day. Then, when my dad got his vacation, we would travel. We went to the Rocky Mountains, but there it was so cold we slept in our car, a Nash, that made into a bed. Boy, were we classy. My dad was a very educated man. He went to inner tube school, Barber College, and every school that you can possibly think of. Of course I believed him. He was always right. I was sure of that. I remember Devil's Lake State Park, and when Daddy was floating in the inner tube, then he got stuck and turned over, and oh my, how he lost his glasses and was still stuck in the tube. Now everyone had to help get him out of the tube and find his glasses, or else we wouldn't be able to get home. Daddy used to do a lot of cooking when we were camping, and then one day we were going to have that ground beef, corn, and tomato sauce all mixed together. Boy, we were hungry, and it was smelling so delicious when Daddy took it off the stove, turned to set it upon the table, and oops, 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 and down in the dirt. It went all over like broken down sandcastle. "Now don't anyone say one word, damn it," he said. It was so funny it tickled me for years. 1950s. Now the 40s turned into the 50s and life continued with much the same pattern. Nels graduated from Rufus King High School in January 1952, and I went from Pleasant View Elementary School to Peckham Junior High. We continued camping. Winters were severe, and Daddy was offered a transfer to Philadelphia. He and Mother decided to stay where they were. However, they needed him in Philly, so he was sent there to help and would come home on weekends. Finally, after 6 months of flying back and forth, we moved in June 1953 to Glenside, Pennsylvania, a suburb of Philly. I graduated from junior high, and about 4 days later we left Milwaukee for good. Now my brother was almost 20 years old, and he decided that he would prefer to remain in Milwaukee, so he got a room and stayed there. He still lives there today. We arrived in Glenside about 4 days before our furniture, which made living a wee bit difficult for a while. Of course, before we left, there was many parties for my parents, and everyone was so sad to see them leave. Now, we didn't live in Glenside very long before Mother and Daddy became active in a new church. St. Peter's Glenside became the love of their life. For the following 6 or 7 years, they gave of their time, energy, money, and every effort that you can think of for the growth and expansion of that church. In 1955, my father was offered a very fine job with Publishers Printers in Long Island City, New York. He decided to take the job, but they also decided that they would remain in the area at least until I finished high school. That entailed traveling back and forth again for my father. During this extra time, my mom had once again become very involved with the church and became the director of religious education at St. Peter's. Now that Sunday school grew from 80 children until they had a staff of 88 teachers and 500 children. Quite a job, and it was worth the effort. During this time in Glenside, my parents looked in vain for a place to camp like it had been at Terry Andre. Now at that time in Pennsylvania, there was no such place in existence. However, they came upon a place near Quakertown called Kelly Farm and were permitted to pitch a tent and go there for weekends or vacations. That is what they decided to do. However, it didn't take long, and they wanted something a little more permanent, so they looked around the Kelly farm and found a small trailer for sale and bought it. Now that too was in time insufficient for their needs, so they built a building around the trailer and it became known as Aqua Rocks. It was a nice place and they enjoyed most weekends there. Now in February 1956, my brother was married in Milwaukee and brought his new bride Joyce to our home in Glenside for his honeymoon and so that we could meet her. In June of that same year I graduated from high school and my parents had grown through another milestone. After I graduated, my parents decided to stay in the area for a while longer. Daddy continued going to New York by train, and I went to work for Bell Telephone. Mother continued to work with St. Peter's, and Nels would come east once or twice a year. I was married in 1959, and my parents decided to move to New York. They took a new apartment in Sunnyside and moved. Now I was living in northern New Jersey on an army post, so I was able to visit quite often. By this time, Nels had 2 boys. Donn was born on September 10, 1957, and David on July 15, 1959. They were really cute, and Mother did a lot of sewing for them. After living at the Buckingham Apartments for about 3 years, they moved to Woodside, about 6 blocks away, and my husband and I moved into the Buckingham. Nels and Joyce had a baby daughter in October 1962, Carol, and we had a daughter, Cheryl, born December 10, 1962. Then in June 1964, Joyce had another boy, Joseph, and we had a son born July 15, 1964, Tommy. While Cheryl was still a baby mother and Daddy decided they would prepare for retiring years and move to Morrisville, Pennsylvania. This way they would be closer to the Blue Lodge where they thought they would retire. Not to be left behind, my husband and I also looked to buy a house in Morrisville. In April 1966, Kimmy was born to round out 7 grandchildren to date. While living in Morrisville and spending the weekends at Kelly Farm, my mother in 1963 suffered a heart attack. She was to have a few more attacks in the years to come, but to this date her health is quite good. They had also made another change at the farm and bought a house named the Blue Lodge about 1960. It is very pretty and they enjoyed having it for many years. About 1970, Daddy retired from publishers because they went out of business. They had planned to stay at Kelly Farm and try out Florida for a possible change. Now about this time I was divorced and they came to help out. They came to live at my house as often as possible to help me out. This was a terrific experience for my children because it gave them memories of their grandparents they would not have otherwise. Now I can just envision Cheryl or Tommy as elderly grandparents telling their grandchildren stories about their early life, and especially about the good sandwiches Grandpa made for lunch. They were going to Florida for the winter months, trying to find a place where they would like to live, and finally located a small place called Sebring, Florida. In September 1973, I married Mickey, and Mother and Daddy moved to Sebring. Mickey had 2 children, Terry and Bonnie, to add to the grandchildren total. By this time the count was 9, pretty many from 2 original children. Shortly thereafter, Nels took as a foster child our cousin Jim's son, Kevin, and that made a grand total of 10. It still is today anyway at last count. I have tried to tell a story about your life together. I have left out many things and have avoided much detail because of the space available. However, I hope that you have found it interesting and enjoyable, and that it has brought some memories that you hadn't thought of in years. It sure was a fulfilling life, and you have accomplished many worthwhile things. Because of your combined efforts, churches were built for others to worship in and enjoy. People were brought together who would never have known each other but for your efforts. You have left in your paths books to read, flowers to enjoy, talents to be passed along, wisdom, kindness, love, and joy. You have made many of my friends from high school until this day richer for having known you. You have created articles to wear, use, and grow upon, like rugs, lamps, and so many others. Your son is a genius. How many other young boys had their room wired so they wouldn't have to get out of bed to turn off a light? Remember when he walked through the house, full of company with a floor lamp in his hand, fully lit, and plug in the other hand, why your friends couldn't believe their eyes. You have given life to a daughter who enjoys her home and family equally as much as her mother, and who has started at this late date to develop some talents that must have laid latent for so many years. Yes, I would say it has been one terrific and super life, and you have done your job well, passing along this wisdom, laughter, joy, and love to others. Your marriage was made in heaven, then put on earth for all to enjoy. It brought life to a daughter and a bouncing baby boy. It has touched on sadness and grief, but has endured for all these years, because of your faith and belief. You have made more friends than most, because you have given it your best, and you have your place in heaven, where you are finally laid to rest. However, your work here is far from through, there is still much for you to do. You must greet each day in a happy way, and the Lord will follow through. Only once do I remember my mother, finally, being wrong, when she said, "Now, Phyllis, you must remember we're not perfect," and it sounded like a song. You must not have been perfect for others, or even for yourself, but certainly, as far as I can see, you definitely were perfect for me. God bless you, and I love you both. Happy 45th anniversary. Love, Phil.